stand up straight and sing.
Yeah, and I'm actually now going to sit up straight and sing as well. Absolutely. It's a very interesting title.
Yes.
Where did the inspiration come from, and what does it mean to you?
The inspiration came exactly from my mother. When I was about sort of brownie age, about sort of 6, 7, or 8, and was going out, even at that time in my life, to sing somewhere, and sort of perhaps slouching a bit onto the stage. My mother didn't think that was very good. So she said, stand up straight there and sing. And so that's the title of the book, Stand Up Straight and Sing.
Now, it's clear from reading your memoir that you grew up not only as a member of a close-knit family,
yes,
but also of a close-knit community.
Yes.
So what was it like growing up in the Norman household and also in the African-American community in Augusta, Georgia, in the late 1940s, 1950s?
Well, growing up in our household, it was very noisy because we all played instruments of some kind. And as soon as we were able to walk on our own, we were sent off to piano lessons. And the boys played various brass instruments in the band. So there was hardly a household that was noisier on a Saturday morning than ours, I can assure you. But we all lived through it. And it was a great place in which to grow up because there were lots of people that were involved in the arts. We had arts, of course, in the public schools. And so one could participate in whatever manner one wished. If you couldn't actually play an instrument in the band, you could pass out the music or set up the chairs, but you were still a member of the band. And I would like to see public schools reinstate arts education into the public school education. It is far too important. Every study that has ever been done on the impact of arts education on a child has shown that regardless of the socioeconomic standing of the guardians or the parents or the community, that all students benefit from arts education and that they do better in all of their other subjects because they learn something that is really very simple, and that is repetition. And that repetition is just the same as if you're learning to play on the G string on a violin, or to play the C-sharp minor scale on the piano, or in first grade trying to learn all the states of the Union, doing it over and over again as you learn when you're painting something or practicing something in the arts, that doing it over and over again makes you better at it. And it can make you better at geography and history and science and mathematics. And that's what we need to tell our legislators, please.
You've actually preempted a later question. I was actually going to say, as you may know, a year or so ago, the Chicago Public Schools reintroduced music into the curriculum.
Yes.
But also in 2003, you established the Jessye Norman School of the Arts in your hometown of Augusta.
Yes.
I assume to help the children in precisely that way.
Yes, absolutely. And also understanding that children coming from disadvantaged backgrounds would not otherwise have the possibility at all of having private education in the arts. And I wish you could see our children. We've got 103 this year. And if you could see the talent that is there, that otherwise might not have been nourished had we not sort of tried to start this school. And the children that come to us tuition free, so I'm always raising money. And feel free. And they have to maintain their good grade averages in regular school. They come to us after school and are with us for 3.5 hours a day. And whatever they are learning with us at the school, they also have to practice at home. So we have agreements with their guardians and their parents, written agreements with their guardians and their parents, that they will see to it that their children actually sort of carry on with their rehearsing. And it is a wonderful thing to see them arrive in September because the children come from different schools. And it's wonderful to see them arrive in September when they don't know the other students. They don't know their peers yet. And they're a little bit shy and perhaps a little bit embarrassed. And they sort of look at the floor. And by the time you go back for Thanksgiving or Christmas, They're walking around with their heads held high and their shoulders back. And they don't say to you that I am Mary Wilson and I want to be a dancer. They say to you, my name is Mary Wilson and I am a dancer. That's in 3 months.
So music was an integral part of your own childhood. I mean, you
Absolutely.
even say in your memoir that you always knew what mood your grandmother was in by the songs she was singing.
Yes, absolutely. She sang all the time, and she had the most beautiful, soothing voice. And it was easy to know her mood and what was going on just from the songs that she sang. If she sang something that was rather sort of slow and a little bit melancholy, at least to my very young ears at the time, then I thought that everything wasn't all right. And if she were singing something that sort of skipped along, that was another clue that everything was quite good.
So you sang obviously at home,
Yes.
in your local church,
Yes.
and in your community. But where did the love of opera begin, and how were you first introduced to that?
I was first introduced to opera on the radio. Thank you, Texaco. And I had been given my very own radio by the time I was about 9 or 10. And I had my very own radio in my very own room, and I could listen to whatever I wanted to without being disturbed by my brothers. And I came upon the Metropolitan Opera broadcasts on a Saturday, really quite by accident. And I found that it was easy to listen to the opera because anyone near my generation knows about Milton Cross. And Milton Cross told you everything you needed to know. He told you what the opera was about. He told you what everybody looked like. He told you what the set looked like. He told you how long that particular act would last. He told you what they were wearing. And so I felt no compunction at all about listening to the opera. And certainly I didn't speak French or Italian or German or anything else in which they were singing, but I wasn't disturbed by that because Milton Cross had told me the story. And the Metropolitan Opera would come on the radio, and on Saturdays, by the time I guess I was about 11 or 12, my responsibility on Saturday was to clean my room. And I thought I was being put upon, actually, to clean my room. And so my cleaning of my room lasted as long as the opera lasted. And then after the opera came Nat King Cole. So I listened to a lot of different things on the radio, and music became my buddy and my friend.
Now, one recurring feature in your memoir is the question of race.
Yes.
You write vividly about your life in Augusta during the civil rights era.
Mm-hmm.
How old were you when you first became aware of prejudice and discrimination, and how did this awareness come about?
Well, it's very difficult to pinpoint a time. I can only say, certainly, before I was even in what we call big school, I was aware that there was meant to be a difference between people and amongst people. And I had an experience of does anybody remember President Eisenhower being a great golfer? And there is a rather distinguished golf course in Augusta, Georgia, and he was there very often. And we knew when he was there because, of course, it was all over the papers. And it was possible to go to the church that he attended on the Sunday and watch him going into church. I mean, it was long before the Secret Service would keep you far away from our leaders. And so it was possible to see him going into the Reed Memorial Church, while at the same time my father would say, now you do understand that this is the leader of our country, but that you would not be welcome in his church. So we would see him going into the church and wave, and he'd wave back to the children, and then we would go to our church. Another thing happened as well. At about the same age, we were going to Philadelphia on the train from Augusta, Georgia, to visit relatives. And we were all dressed up, you know, that's the way people used to travel. And I was wearing my Sunday dress. And of course, by then I had learned to read. My mother was a teacher, so we all knew how to read by the time we were 4 years old. And I could read whites only and colored only. And we were sitting, of course, on the side that was designated for people with my skin color. And I noticed that there was no one sitting on the side that said whites only. So I decided I'd go and sit there. And my mother, and probably my father as well, said, well, why don't you come back over here and sit down? I said, well, nothing's happening, everything's fine, there's really no problem, I don't know what that means, and so that I'll just stay here. And to their sort of chagrin, I kept playing on the rails and having a great time, and actually nothing did happen. So in my mind, I decided that if only people understood and left one another alone, that we would be just fine, and that we would come to a conclusion very soon, I told myself, that these signs would come down. I was a very naive child.
But sadly, as you say, that didn't happen, and as the movement escalated, you were not a bystander. You
No,
certainly
I was not.
became very involved. Can you talk a little bit about what you did, particularly with the NAACP?
Yes, my parents, of course, were members of the NAACP, and my brother, who's only 4 years older than I, was the president of the youth chapter of the NAACP. By then, he was a freshman, I guess, at college, at Payne College in Augusta, Georgia. And of course, there were sit-ins and marches organized, and we would be given money by the NAACP to go and sit in at these lunch counters and order food. And of course, it was very difficult for a lot of the people that were serving, because they were also African American. They were concerned about our welfare as we were concerned about their losing their jobs. So the whole thing was fraught with tension and distress, but we went ahead because we understood that's what we needed to do. It happened on one occasion that we were picketing in front of a grocery store, a very large grocery store, that was definitely in our neighborhood, in our community, but which would only employ African Americans for menial jobs, even though they were selling to the African American community. And so we were picketing this store, and as difficult as it is to believe, a car came careening down the street, jumped the curb, and was heading towards us. And had it not been for the screams of the children that were in the back, who knows what might have happened to those of us that were closer to the front and closer to the car. And it is very difficult to imagine that there would be a grown person that would take it upon himself, that his mind would say that it's all right to take your car of tons of steel and glass and run down little children. It didn't happen to us, but it could have.
Have you ever felt that racial prejudice affected your career?
I've not felt that directly, but it would be disingenuous to pretend that it hasn't, or that it couldn't, or that it doesn't, because it certainly affects everybody else in any other discipline in the world, and certainly in our country. So to say that no one has actually said to my face that I would not be hired for something because of my skin color, that is something that did not happen, or has not happened yet. But it would certainly not be true, I'm sure, to say that it's never occurred. One has to understand, however, that my first performance as a professional singer in an opera took place in Berlin, the Deutsche Oper Berlin, which is in West Berlin, and that I was invited to sing a quintessential German, pure as the driven snow character, Elisabeth in Tannhäuser. Egon Seefellner, who was the artistic director of the opera house there, was a very brave man, because he invited me to sing that opera, that part. The other part, Venus, had been sung 8 years earlier by Grace Bumbry in Bayreuth, and it created an absolute sensation. It's one thing to be invited to sing the bad girl. It's another thing to be invited to sing the one who becomes a nun at the end.
I'd like to return to your time in Berlin in just a moment, but could I just ask one more question? Do you think things have changed for young African American performers today entering the music, the performing arts?
I would hope so. I don't see enough African Americans on the stages of the opera houses around the world. And the reason for that is simply a lack of opportunity, because the talent is certainly there, I can tell you that. And it is a bittersweet thought, and I talk about this in the book, that I remain the only African American woman who starred in Wagner operas. Whether you're talking about here or Covent Garden or anywhere else in Europe or anywhere actually, and it really is, it is rather ridiculous when you think about it, that Kundry and Sieglinde, Isolde and Elizabeth and Elsa, that other African Americans have not been able to, or invited, to sing these roles. Perhaps they're not interested in them. But it is rather bittersweet to say that after all these years, that is the case.
Now you have devoted an entire chapter of your memoir to the great American singer Marian Anderson. Clearly she was a major inspiration for you, not only as an artist, but as an African American woman.
Yes.
What is it about her that was so important to you, and what did you learn from her legacy?
I learned from being able to, if you can imagine it, having private teas with Marian Anderson. It sounds absolutely surreal, doesn't it? But in New York State, where I live, I was only 45 minutes from her door in Danbury, Connecticut. And on the days when I would be at home, I would simply ring the housekeeper to say, I'm going to be at home for 10 days, and any day that Miss Anderson felt like having company, just ring me up and I'll drop whatever else I'm doing and come over and have a little visit. And she was always extremely welcoming. And of course, I had 1,000 questions that I wanted to ask her. And she never wanted to talk about herself. She always deflected the questions. And she would rather ask me what I'd been singing and where I'd been and whether or not I'd been treated well and whether I was still enjoying the singing and all of that, which of course was amazing and would humble me even further in her presence. And the thing that I learned from her was her ability to take her faith and call upon it at every given moment. And on those occasions, which she recalls in her autobiography, My Lord, What a Morning, she tells about not being able to stay in a hotel in the South, or being forced to press her own fabulous performing gowns, not in the basement of the hotel, but outside in the alley. That such a thing could happen to such a person has been something that I have kept in my mind, and it really keeps one grounded and humble and understanding on whose very broad and very strong shoulders one stands. And the majesty and grace with which she lived her life was something that I wish you could all have experienced personally, because it was really quite something. She was of deep faith. She always referred to herself as we, and she didn't mean we being herself and her accompanist, or herself and Robert Shaw or whomever was conducting from her. She meant herself and her creator. And it was a marvelous thing to be able to be in her presence and to just be able to speak with her and to understand that her faith brought her through many a trial, and that there was nothing that could shake it. It was really quite wonderful. It was rather, I really consider it as being in the presence of the Dalai Lama, which I experienced only a couple of years ago. But there are certain people on this earth that seem to have a glow, that seem to have an aura around them that is just so peaceful. I felt the same way in having the privilege of meeting Mr. Nelson Mandela. There are people whose spirits are so without tension, and so without any kind of thoughts of revenge or unhappiness at something that has happened to them, because they're so full of love in every instance. That's a great lesson to learn.
So it was particularly fitting then that when you competed in the Marian Anderson competition in Philadelphia, although you didn't win that one,
No, I sure did.
you actually received a scholarship, which then began your serious musical training.
Yes. I went to Philadelphia for the Marian Anderson competition, and the age group for the competition was 16 to 30. So now you might imagine there were a few people there that were more experienced than I, considering I wasn't quite 16. But I traveled to Washington, to Philadelphia with my middle school choir director, Rosa Sanders, and we went and we performed the songs that we rehearsed. And one of my songs, I'm afraid, was a Schubert song in English. And I didn't win a prize, but the sister of Marian Anderson was very, very dear and very kind, and came to me and said, "Now, how old are you really?" And I said, "Well, I'm almost 16. I'll be 16 very soon." And so she said, "Now, after you've finished high school, and perhaps after you've had some vocal training, we'd like you to come back, and we're going to keep an eye on you." And I thought, well, that's all I needed. That was fine. That was wonderful. And it happened that on the way back from Philadelphia, my chaperone, Rosa Sanders, and I both have relatives in Washington, and it was a Friday afternoon, so why not stop in Washington and visit our relatives? But it also turned out that the dean of the School of Music at Howard University had been the dean of students when Rosa Sanders was a student at Payne College. And so she knew him and knew that he was now at Howard University. And so without any prelude at all, we simply called him and said that we were in town and we'd like to come over and see him at the university. And so he invited us to come over. And we spoke for a moment and told him what had happened in Philadelphia and why we were there and all the rest. And he decided that we should go up and speak with the head of the voice department at Howard University. So I thought that sounded like a good idea. So up we went, and it happens that Professor Carolyn Grant was in the middle of teaching a graduate course in vocal anatomy and the respiratory system. And so we stood outside the room until she noticed that there was somebody hanging around outside her door. And she came to us, and Dean Fax explained why we were there, and she beckoned us to enter the room, which we did. And so she announced to the class why we were there and asked me to sing something that I had sung in Philadelphia. And of course, at the time, I wasn't concerned about whether or not I'd warmed up or whether I was ready or whether I had on the right shoes or the right dress or any of that sort of nonsense. And I sang, and she thanked us and asked us to wait outside until the class was over. And as, again, another fairy tale, Professor Grant came out of her room and she said, "Now, I hope that you are doing very well in high school." And I said, "Oh, yes, I'm on the dean's list." And so she said, "Well, your high school transcript will have to bear that out. But when you are done with high school, I would like to teach you at Howard University." And it was truly absurd that by the time Monday morning rolled around, we had already had a call from the dean of the College of Fine Arts, who was Warner Lawson at the time. And of course, the School of Music was within the College of Fine Arts, that he had called to say that they had already checked on my high school transcript and that I would be welcomed at Howard University after high school with a full tuition scholarship.
And then you go on to the University of Michigan, where you get your master's. And then a few years after that, you arrive in Berlin in your mid-20s. So you're leaving behind America in a very tense state, and you arrive in probably one of the tensest European capitals at that time. Berlin, divided, of course, by the Berlin Wall. You say two very interesting things, I think, in your chapter about your time in Berlin. First was that you felt you grew up
Oh,
as a person in
absolutely,
Berlin.
without a doubt.
And the other was you experienced a cultural revolution.
Yes, I did. Because we know that at the time, Berlin was divided as the country of Germany was divided. And I was working in West Berlin, and there were things in East Berlin that interested me. And so with an American passport, an English passport or French passport, one could travel very easily from one part of Berlin to the other through Checkpoint Charlie. You've all heard about Checkpoint Charlie. And it is amazing that this was not going over an overpass or a bridge or anything else. It was simply walking across the road, walking across one side of Friedrichstraße to the other side of Friedrichstraße. And you were not only in a different country, you were in a different philosophy. You were in a completely different social, political situation. And I met friends that were my same age. I was 24 at the time. And we became fast friends and visited the wonderful museums in East Berlin. And I saw for the first time German Expressionism. Somehow we had skipped over that in art appreciation in the States. And I was seeing works by artists that were new to me. And I found that really most enlightening. I found it also enlightening to be in this divided city. This had all changed while I was in middle school. We talked about it, we learned about it, and studied that the wall had been erected only in 1961. That there were people who had, in this huge city, and Berlin is really large, until that wall went up, they were traveling back and forth with ease. And then one day, they found themselves on one side of the wall, and that is where they were meant to stay. And it was extraordinary to me to get to know some of the families of the students with whom I become friends, to have a person, nearly 60 years old, to ask me, tell me what Paris looks like. Where exactly is the Eiffel Tower? Is it really as beautiful as they all say? And I would sometimes just burst into tears, thinking that he was a person that was an hour and 15 minutes plane ride from where he lived, but because of the political situation, he couldn't travel to a city as beautiful as Paris. And so I tried to soften the tension a bit by saying, I think that Paris is kind of a slightly bigger version of Dresden.
Now, as with your protests in America, your feelings of injustice spurred you into action in Germany as well. This time it was to help a fellow singer who was living in the East, and you really helped her to defect. Can you talk a little about that?
Well, without identifying her, as I do not in the book, but I do tell the story, that I came across a very beautiful singer when I was making a recording early in my own professional life in East Berlin, and I thought, what a beautiful singer. And it happened that we were at the Edinburgh Festival about a year and a bit after that, and I sought her out and invited her to tea. I was staying in one of these very grand places in Scotland where they rented apartments for the summer, and so I had an apartment inside one of these very, very beautiful houses on gorgeous grounds and all the rest of it. So I wanted her to see this and to come and visit me. And while we were walking, and I was sure that we could not be overheard, I allowed myself to say to her, why don't you just stay? And she said, I couldn't do that because my mother and I are very close, and it's only the two of us. My father died, she said, a long time ago. I don't have siblings. And so I couldn't possibly leave her. And that was kind of the end of that conversation. But because the universe is amazing, a few years later, we were singing in the same city, in Vienna. And so I had a conversation with her again about the idea. And she seemed more open to the idea at that time of defecting. And so it took us about a year to really plan it, because she was by that time being invited by various opera houses to perform. She was really coming into her own. And we would sometimes find ourselves in the same city. And in order to manage this, what she was doing was leaving some of her things in the West each time she would come, so that she wouldn't leave East Berlin with sort of suitcases and suitcases of things and be noticed in that way. And we had a friend of ours in southern Germany to help with this. And we were singing in Vienna again the following year in the same opera. And by this time, the defection was planned. And I don't think, and I write, that I don't think she ever sang better than that night. She was so full of energy and beauty and ease on stage. I think that she felt already that she was free. And so instead of returning with the rest of her colleagues from East Germany, she got into a car and was taken to southern Germany. And it was only after she was installed overnight did she call her mother and say what she'd done. And we didn't dare speak on the phone, of course. And it was through the post that we kept up with one another. She was pleased with what she'd done, but she, of course, was lonely for her mother. And we couldn't have imagined, we simply could not have imagined that 3 years after that, the wall in Berlin would come down almost with people taking it down by their hands. And she and her mother were reunited, and she retired only about 3 years ago from having had a fantastic career in the European opera houses.
And amazingly, of course, as the wall was crumbling,
Yes.
you were in Germany recording of all operas.
No,
Fidelio.
that happened afterwards. When the wall came down, it's an interesting thing, because I was working in China, I was in Taiwan, and there was a report that in Beijing that they were doing operations, surgical operations, with acupuncture and Mozart. I said, now this I have to see. And so I was trying like mad to get a visa to go to Beijing. And as is usual, we were having a fight with China. So it was very difficult to get a visa. And I'd called everybody whose name I knew to try to get something done. And it seemed that I was not going to be able to go. And I was actually on my way out of the hotel room in which I was staying, going to a performance. And the phone rang, and I picked up, I said, no, I heard you, I'll be downstairs in just 10 minutes or something. And the person said, what are you talking about? And so I said, who is this? And so he said, I just called you to let you know the wall is coming down. And of course, I thought he was talking about the Great Wall of China. And so I said, what on earth happened? I mean, if there had been an earthquake, it would have been felt in Taiwan, it would have been felt everywhere. I mean, it wasn't, it was thousands of miles away, but still. And so for a moment, I was confused. And so finally, my friend understood that I was confused, and he said, no, I'm talking about the Berlin Wall. Go and turn on CNN and see what is happening. And so I forgot all about going to the performance and turned on television and didn't know quite where CNN was, sort of on the thing. Did finally found it. And it was amazing. The person that was accompanying me on the piano on that tour, also American, but we met at the Opera House in Berlin. And he still lived in Berlin at that time. By then I had moved. And it was an incredible thing for the two of us to go on stage that night, having met in Berlin, knowing that through some miracle, the wall was coming down that night. And we sang those Brahms Lieder, I think, as we had never sung them before.
I'm sure. I was very touched by your definition of singing
Uh-huh.
in your memoir. You say, I'll quote you word for word,
Mm-hmm.
singing for me is actually life itself. It is communication, person to person and soul to soul, a physical, emotional, spiritual, and intellectual expression carried by the breath, life.
Yes.
How do you transcend the technical challenge of singing to achieve emotional and spiritual communication? It's a very easy question.
Oh, yes, a very easy question. I would only need about 2 hours to talk about. I use the word lucky a lot because it applies to me in so many ways, as I'm sure it applies to you and your lives. But I was very lucky to work first with a teacher who really wanted to be a voice teacher. She had never aspired to be on stage herself. What she wanted to do was to help us to understand how the body functions and how the respiratory system actually produces a noise and why, and through what mechanisms within us, so that singing stops being this kind of vague thing that we're hoping is going to be all right on the night, but knowing how the body functions can put the mind at ease, even when you're a bit tired, or you haven't slept very well, or you are simply not feeling sort of like doing a performance that night. But you have to do it because you're a professional, and that is what one is called upon to do. And so having that information and understanding how this all works, it really makes it possible to forget about the physiology of singing and concentrate on the communication, the words. We as singers, as I write, have an added level of responsibility. We have words, and they must be understood. And if we are doing our jobs properly, as I always say, it should not matter that our audiences might not speak Italian or French or German or Spanish. They should know from the way that we sing a word, from how we deport ourselves in the process of an operatic role. They should know just about what is happening. And even if you speak the language, it is not necessarily true that you're going to understand every single word anyway. But I do feel that with an understanding of the physiology of singing, of the respiratory system, of the body, the way this functions in all of us, we just make different kinds of noises, that it puts the mind at ease and clarifies the situation so that one can concentrate on the work at hand, which is for you to understand what I would like you to understand about the music, and my energy goes to you, and your energy comes back to me, and we have a beautiful circle, and we call that music.
That's wonderful. You've answered my next 4 questions.
I'm sorry, I talk rather much.
It's fine.
It's my father's fault.
Absolutely fine. Your repertoire was eclectic, very diverse, very interesting. Interestingly, you say that in your early days, you were being encouraged to sing the Italian repertoire, but you felt that was wrong. Now, in your memoir, at the end of each chapter, you end with a quote from a text, whether it's a hymn, whether it's a poem, whether it's a German lied or a melody, but often it's a spiritual.
Yes, well, the spirituals are at the beginnings of the chapters.
I was actually telling you just before we started our discussion this evening that as a music student, I bought your LP of these amazing spirituals. I knew what a spiritual was, but I hadn't actually heard one before. And I was completely astounded by the intensity of emotion.
Thank you.
Tell us about your relationship with spirituals, because they've played a very important part in your performing life, in your recital programs, but if not actually in the actual program, as encores to recitals as well.
Well, it would be rather ridiculous, considering my heritage, were spirituals not a part of my musical canon. These are the songs of my ancestors. Let us not confuse a spiritual and a gospel song. A spiritual, an American spiritual, can only have been created by the enslaved. This would have been between the early 1600s and the middle of the 19th century. All of that time, there are thousands of spirituals. The Smithsonian has done a fantastic job, particularly with Bernice Johnson Reagan, in putting these together and showing us which spirituals came out of North Carolina, which spirituals actually were created in Kentucky and in other places. They are that definite and that defined and that categorized at the Smithsonian. It's really quite wonderful. And because these are songs that I have heard all of my life and which I have sung all of my life, I am encouraged and inspired and absolutely blown away by going to any country on this planet and having people ask me, well, I hope at the end, it doesn't matter what else is on the program, I hope that you're going to sing a spiritual, because my mother told me about the time when Marian Anderson came in 1953 and sang a spiritual, and it was just amazing, and we really hope that you will do so as well. And of course I do. And it is really a great gift to know that it was possible for my ancestors to find a way to sing themselves through the horror, not out of the horror, but through. You see, the drums had already been taken away. Think of thousands of people that are living in an area and they have no tongue that is the same. They've come from different places in Africa, not just from West Africa, as was first thought. They had no common language. So they were learning rudimentary English from the people that were their overseers. These were not educated people, so they did not learn to speak English necessarily properly. But the Bible was the only book that was allowed. Learning to read was discouraged, however, but people did anyway, because the human spirit is not so easily challenged and wilts. And so the spiritual and all that it means is something that is very personal to a great, great number of people. And it is marvelous to be in Norway or in Stockholm or in Regensburg in Germany and have someone come up and say, my grandmother told me about the time that Roland Hayes came to sing. And the last group on his program were spirituals, and he sang a spiritual that my mother learned to sing to me, Steal Away. Do you know that one, Miss Norman? I said, yes, I know that one.
Now, the excerpt from the four last songs and that spiritual are just two of your many, many recordings. Do you find their permanence daunting or rewarding?
I don't find any difficulty with a recording. It is simply a recording of that particular moment. And I've come to understand that. I know that a lot of my colleagues say, oh, I can't bear to listen to my performance because it's changed so much, and I do this and I do that now. And I just have to release that because it's there and there isn't anything one can do about it. But I do accept that it is a document of that particular moment on that particular day. And being me, I probably would have sung it quite differently, sort of 3 hours later.
I'm going to change track now. Now, in your book, you're very frank about your working relationships with conductors and directors. Mm-hmm. No names mentioned. What are the qualities No names mentioned. What are the qualities that you seek in both an ideal conductor and an ideal director?
An ideal director and an ideal conductor would be a person who is actually interested in a collaboration. It isn't possible, as in days of old, when singers were very rarely trained musicians. They had learned to sing wonderfully, but they had not necessarily studied art history or music literature, and therefore found themselves listening to the conductor and accepting what perhaps that person would have to say about the interpretation of a role or the interpretation of a song or an aria. That isn't true these days. We go to conservatories, we go to universities, and we learn as the conductors do. So, and as the directors do. And so an ideal person in either of these positions for me would be one who is able to talk and discuss and to listen, and for us to come to a mutual decision as to how we are going to proceed. I say this so often to my younger colleagues. I was having a conversation the other day with a beautiful coloratura soprano. It is a beautiful voice. You're going to hear lots from her. And she was getting ready to sing the Exultate Jubilate. And she's got, hallelujah, hallelujah. And I said, now what is the tempo that you need in order to sing that particular part? And she said, this is the tempo. I said, now that is what you have to say to the conductor. You've only got 2 rehearsals. You don't have time to learn how quickly he wants to do this. What he has to do is to listen to you. And she said, oh, I couldn't possibly. I said, well, then you're going to be in trouble. And by the time I let her go, poor darling, she'd come around to the idea that it probably would be possible to say to the conductor that at this point in her life, at this point in her training, at this point in her experience, this is the tempo that she would need to sing that particular part. And being me, of course, I called her after the performance. I said, how'd it go? She said, do you know he said okay? He said, all right. I said, yes. They don't all bite.
And what about directors?
Directors can be a little bit more complicated. Because a lot of directors coming to opera these days have done other things, film and stage works for the spoken word, and they really haven't the faintest idea about singing. And I write in my book a very short passage about sort of being sort of my usual busybody self. And we were rehearsing, and a younger singer than I was singing another part in the opera. And the director wanted her to rush up a flight of stairs and sing, which of course would be fabulous if you could. And so, you know, she, bless her heart, she was trying, she'd rush up the stairs and out of breath, and I stood by, of course, had nothing to do with me. I'm not even in the scene. And my character's not in the scene. And so when there was time for us to have a little break, I said to the conductor, could I have a word, the director? Could I have a word? And he said, oh, what is it, Miss Nolan? And so I said, physics would tell us that it is really rather difficult to run up against gravity and have something left in the lungs at the top of it. It is possible to run downstairs and sing, but running upstairs and singing is just a tad more difficult. And if it were possible that she might run up maybe the last 2, and it might give the same effect, except that her lungs would not be empty. and she could possibly do this. She's young, and why not? And he listened thinking, I wish she would leave me alone. But we did try it. And in the end, she sang absolutely beautifully because she was no longer worried about the one part of the opera that was disturbing her, not her voice, not her part, but the action. That, of course, you can imagine it. It would look fantastic, this sort of marvelous sort of character, and they were sort of rushing up a flight of stairs in a beautiful dress, and she can't wait to see her lover. But, of course, you can't sing. It's a nice thought, but it wasn't working. And to his credit, I have to admit that the director didn't know. He'd never worked with a singer before. He'd only worked in the spoken word theater and in film. So in film, of course, you can rush up the stairs and singing because the singing is coming from a track. But that sort of thing happens, and I've had my own personal moments when I've had to say, that is a wonderful idea. It would be lovely, but it's not possible. And I hope that we will be able to come to a different decision.
And did you?
I always smile when I'm begging.
Of your many great achievements, which make you the most proud?
Oh, I couldn't possibly choose. I think one of the things that sort of makes me smile widely every time is talking about the school, because I know that it changes the lives of these children and that it will go on changing their lives. We're not at the school trying to grow little Marian Andersons or Yasha Heifetz or Isaac Stearns or any of the other great performers. Our aim is to help to develop whole people. And we know that this is possible through the arts. We know that this is possible from understanding how to interact with other people, how to sing in a choir and not be the loudest person singing, but to blend your voice with someone else's, so that when you're in the workplace, whatever that happens to be later in life, you have learned to share and to be kind and to understand and to interact in a positive way with other people. That is the aim of the school. And if they should become professional performers after that, that's a plus.
Sadly, we are running out of time, but there are two more questions that I would like to ask you. Do you have any regrets?
I regret that I didn't take the time. I didn't actually have the time, but that I didn't really take the time to learn Russian. There are so many beautiful, beautiful songs in Russian, arias and operas and so on that I would love to do, but I don't sing in a language that I don't speak. And so not having taken the time to learn Russian, I regret that I haven't done it. It doesn't mean that I won't do it, but I regret that I haven't done it thus far. I went so far as to hiring a young student from the Sorbonne whose grandparents were Russian, and he spoke really beautiful Russian. And so I hired him. I was doing a tour in Europe, and I said, well, you come along on the tour. It wasn't sort of within the summer months, so he wasn't obligated to be at university. And within that 2 months, I had time for about 3 hours of lessons. I thought that was a rather expensive way to learn Russian. And so he was from Paris. I sent him back home. And I'm afraid that was the end of my Russian studies until now, but who knows? Maybe I'll take it up tomorrow.
So, how would you most like to be remembered?
Remembered. Remembered as being so happy to sing a song. So happy to play a role. So happy that music has imbued and infused my life.
And all of that you're saying now, of course, has been the case for so many people that have listened to your performances throughout your distinguished career.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Miss Jessye Norman.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.